I've received several questions about the pantheistic nihilism thing, and understandably so, because it's sort of a tricky phrase, somewhat intentionally. And today I wanted to go into the nihilism portion of that. I am a nihilist, but it's a tricky word, because a lot of people take it to certain extremes, like the belief that there is no objective reality whatsoever. And it's even more in a more extreme position than solipsism. Solipsism says that there is no objective reality outside of the self. Nihilism says that even the self is an illusion. But I mean, epistemologically it's tenable. I just don't know that it's very useful in modeling reality. I think there are more useful ways of conceiving of things. But I do go ahead and subscribe to moral nihilism, the belief that morality has no objective existence. In the self or in the outside world. I mean, we have preferences, but I feel like morality, because it is a different word, because it seems to imply something, I think we need to really tease out what morality is before we can even begin to assert anything to its existence. So morality is a very common belief. It's something that's ingrained from a very early age. Even among atheist families, there's constant talk about the right thing or wrong thing to do, or something that you do being good or bad. And you being a little kid, you just assimilate the data. An authority figure tells you something, so you try and fit it into your worldview. And so most of us, at least at an early age, believe in morality because it just seems so obvious. I think there's a lot of very intelligent people out there who do believe in objective morality. I mean, someone like Stefan Molyneux, I mean, he has a lot of faults in his arguments. He has a lot of good arguments, too. I think a lot of people sort of just discount Steph Bott because of his eccentricities. But at the same time, I believe the guy has some good things to say, about child rearing, violence, spanking. Yeah, we do respond to our environment, and if you create a violent environment for a child, it will turn out to be violent. It's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. Human psychology is not terribly complicated once you understand the mechanisms of conditioning. But anyway, let's sort of get into the issue of morality itself. So one way that every Ethics 101 course in the university deals with this is something like the trolley problems. They love thought experiments, and somehow that's meant to tease out truths about morality itself. But I mean, we'll investigate whether that's the case. So the trolley problems, though, are pretty simple. They go that there's a track with two branches. On one side, there's a family tied to the track, and on the other, there's a lone individual. And the train's coming barreling down. Right now, the track is set so that it'll diverge into the family. And you are standing near a lever, which would operate the switch and change the course to run on with the individual. So in that case, what is right to do? But that's the problem I really have with the trolley problems, is the question itself is loaded. By asking what is the right thing to do, you're assuming there is a right thing to do, and it really bothers me that so many university ethics courses begin this way. They begin by asking, in this situation, what is right? And I mean, to be fair, some courses do later go on to investigate the issue of right itself. What is it to be right? What is it to be a good person? But it's really, I think, framing the whole discussion around these thought experiments is really setting yourself up for failure in a certain respect, because you're establishing yourself within a investigatory mechanism which is fundamentally removed from the issue at hand, the issue of morality itself. By examining issues wherein we discuss the value of morality, we're trying to tease out details about the way morality behaves and the properties of morality without actually getting to its heart. And so for me, morality must have sort of a mechanism, right? There must be something that produces it. There must be a stuff there of which morality consists. Otherwise, it is nothing. I think it's sort of just, maybe it's circular at this point, but I think it's true that in order for something to exist, it must have components which exist. If a thing exists without having components which exist, it's sort of just one of those things that defies imagination. It seems as though it may be some sort of, if not a metaphysical possibility, at least a conceptual impossibility, and certainly a physical impossibility, because it runs counter to everything we observe. There is nothing that we see that exists itself, but which has no component that exists. And maybe you'd say like an irreducible entity entity may exist without having components, but in that case, it has one component. It has the component which it itself comprises, and that exists. But then you get into the issue of singularities and the self-identity of matter. And I guess I'll just diverge for a second and say, well, all electrons are the same. All particles that are irreducible are identical in the sense that they share an identity. And an identity in this case is just the list of describing qualities of that item. All electrons are the same. And even to a further extent, according to the standard model of quantum mechanics, all those particles really do stem from the same fields. Electrons are all particular manifestations of an underlying force that goes beyond just the particle. There's a wave field from which all these various components of matter are derived. But anyway, so that's all just going to say that in order for something to exist, it must have components which exist. And morality, when you try and talk about an objective morality in a situation, you run into some problems, because objective, the word, attempts to address something beyond the subjective, beyond what we as humans feel and think and attempt to describe. Objective morality, it really does make some sort of metaphysical claim about the basis of morality. And I'm just saying, if there is that objective morality that exists out there apart from ourselves, what is the mechanism for it? That's all I'm asking. I don't see it. I've never seen it. I've never seen it pointed to by anyone. It just seems like nonsense. And at an intuitive level, I think it is nonsense. I mean, remove the people from that situation. Remove the subjects from the trolley cart problem, and, replace it with some other thing that could be destroyed, a bunch of glass balls, or, a single glass ball, and are you going to diverge the train then? Or a computer could decide whether the train's going to... Is there a moral quality to that situation? It would seem that morality rests in human value. And that's not a contentious claim. I think a lot of people come to that conclusion, that sure, maybe objective morality in the sense that morality exists outside of ourselves doesn't exist, but surely human value exists. And I would agree. But then I would point to Nietzsche's sort of master morality. Human value exists, but it's created by each individual. Because here, if the mechanism of morality is the mind, is the individual mind, then we run into a certain inequality of minds that prevents morality from really being universal. And that's the kind of thing that people like Stefbot put forward, that, yeah, morality may not be objective in that sense, but it is universal among humans. There's universal human values. And well, first of all, from sort of an evolutionary perspective, why would it be that all these different cultures, all these different lineages of man all over the world evolved precisely the same system of value? There are certain behaviors that tend to be selected for all over the place. And, in that sense, humans do have universal preferences. We all want to live. Well, and even that's not true, though. I mean, no matter what criterion you use, there is no universality in human value. Humans value different things. And this is a very fundamental psychological hang-up that I think a lot of people fall into. They don't want to admit that people can have different opinions than themselves. They don't want to admit that other people have different systems of value, and that they can conflict with yours and still not be wrong. What we like to do is give our own value systems credibility and authority by asserting that they're universal, by asserting that it's somehow objective. And it's such a natural inclination. And I observe it I'm watching a 3-year-old right now. It's been very informative for psychology. But he operates within a sort of game theory constantly with regards to his morality. He decides something is right, but he doesn't say because I want it to be so. He says because that's the nature of the game. And it's a childish inclination, but it's one that is shared by a large portion of humanity. I mean, that's what every religion attempts to do. They say that this is the morality and everyone else is wrong. And even atheists, they believe that, secular ethics are the right ones. I mean, not all atheists, clearly, but a large majority that I've met. And I can only speak to the samples that I've been introduced to. But again, the same thing falls into libertarian camps too. And, I sympathize with a lot of libertarian beliefs, but the idea that the non-aggression principle, I agree that it's pragmatically a good way to form a society. But at the same time, it's nothing close to a universal system of morality. Not everyone dislikes aggression. Some people like murder and violence. And they're not wrong, It's only a system of human value, and because the mechanism is individual minds, you have to account for the variability of minds. And here's the step that I don't see, and maybe my whole position is just flawed based on my this sort of inaccessibility on my part. My question is, how do you get from the mechanism of morality being the individual minds to there are universal preferences for humans? That's something that I've never seen, and so I come to the conclusion that there isn't anything. There isn't anything grouping together all these individual systems of morality. All that exists is the individual's subjective preference. And not everyone believes this. A lot of people believe in an exterior system of morality, but in that belief, all they're doing is adopting another person's morality as their own. In the end, their morality is their morality, and there's a lot of religious people who have moral conundrums where their sort of innate biological inclinations counteract the moral system that they have subscribed to. And it just seems to point to the dissonance that arises within many people when they realize that their beliefs are no more right, their moral beliefs are no more right than anyone else's. We want to believe that the system of morality we subscribe to is objective, but it's just not so. And so that's moral nihilism. And, I really would appreciate discussion from someone with a different viewpoint, because it's something that I haven't really been exposed to. I've been exposed to moral absolutists on the religious side, and I've been exposed to some philosophical moral absolutists who try and make claims about universal human value and things. But I've examined those philosophies, and they're flawed. I mean, Steph Bott's what does he call it? Like universally preferable behavior. I went ahead and read his thing because he seemed like a smart guy, and I wanted to find out. But his conclusions don't follow. It's really simple. It's riddled with logical fallacies and non sequitur, and it's not a rigorous paper. It's his musings on what he believes morality to be. Anyway, so in that sense, I mean, moral nihilism, maybe you'd rather call it moral relativism, but I mean, that's the definition of moral nihilism, is the belief in there is no objective morality. So that's sort of the universalized portion of moral nihilism. But I would also go ahead and say that on the inside, morality doesn't really exist. All that exists are beliefs and preferences. And because we have the words beliefs and preferences, I don't see why morality really it's not a useful construct. It only serves to obfuscate. Morality only serves to confound the public's understanding of value, because preference, is always conditional, and it is always individual. And I think the sooner people realize that, the sooner they'll be able to make pragmatic decisions for their lives, and they'll try to lead their lives in accordance with their preference. And this kind of leads into my political philosophy as well, because lacking a universal system of morality, everyone doesn't have to agree. Not everyone has to be libertarian, not everyone has to be socialist. I don't even think that socialism, not necessarily the best system economically, but I don't have any problem with someone else going off and being a socialist. You can do whatever the hell you want. I don't care. Just don't bother me, That's all. That's my system of value. I don't care what anyone else does. They can do whatever they like. It's none of my business. That's as I see it. And I think that's the silent majority. The silent majority doesn't care what everyone else wants to do with their lives. They only care about their own life, their own particular life. Yeah, I mean, when I attempt to construct political philosophy, all I can really construct is what is the political system that I would want to live in. So I think in a pragmatic way, moral nihilism leads to better government, because people understand that we're constructing something conditional and relevant only to ourselves. And that's I do appreciate social contract theory, not the sort of implicit social contract. The sort of the natural state is barbarism, Monism, and then humans collectively have formed these implicit social contracts to abide by all these conventions and all that. I mean, that's BS. That's not really what happened. That original condition, as it is stated, never really happened. Culture evolved in a much more complicated way. But I think there is some usefulness in the idea of a social contract itself, an explicit social contract. I think that when people form political associations, they ought to sign contracts. They ought to say, these are the presuppositions of our society. This is the group of things that we collectively find acceptable and we collectively find unacceptable. And that way there's no sort of murky waters of what is okay, and you don't even need the Constitution and the court system to change with the society. All you need to do is continuously replace old, decrepit societies. I think it, in a sense, even though it would mean more chaos in a certain respect, it would mean more cultural shift, it would mean stronger governmental bonds when they do happen. Because if you dissolve a contract when the original members are not signed into it anymore, then the next generation will be able to form a contract contextual to the technology and culture available to them at the time. And that's really what's important for politics. And that's why I think it's absurd operating under, centuries-old political system, because we didn't have anything to do with crafting this. We inherited it. And I don't think that a political system, something that's formed around a social contract, which, according to moral nihilism, is something that must be an explicit construction, because all morality, all systems of value must be constructed. So inheriting political systems doesn't really hold any utility compared to provisionally crafting explicit social contracts to meet the situation at hand, because that's the best we can ever do. That's the only thing we can ever really do. But I guess that's moral nihilism in a nutshell. I really would like some thoughts, especially if you disagree. Always want to hear disagreement, because that's when you improve, is when you expose yourself to disagreement. But now I'd like to go ahead and diverge a little bit into some other types of nihilism that I also agree with. And it's not so far as the sort of metaphysical nihilist position that nothing exists whatsoever. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist, and that's sort of the Buddhist position that fundamentally everything, the phenomenon of existence is an illusion, in that really things are codependently related, but they form from emptiness. The things don't exist, only the relations of these non-things exist. And it's a little confusing, and you'd have to really get into Buddhism extensively to sort of understand the logic of that position. But again, I'm not a Buddhist. I think there are better ways of conceiving it. So basically, the Buddhist position is that reality has no substance, but that phenomenon, that relation, codependently arises. That's a perfectly good way of explaining what we see. The only thing is that it sort of ignores this metaphysical realm, but it somehow finds that the explanation of emptiness causing relation is adequate. And there are a couple different ways where that actually sort of does make sense, like the I wish I could remember this guy's name. Anyway, it's a set theory that a null set, a set of no things, has an existence insofar as it is a set, and that then you can take a set of empty sets, and then that set above the empty set has an existence. It sort of goes into number theory, so numbers are created out of this empty set being categorized within a set with existence of empty sets, and that's sort of the thing with existence without components of existence. And I disagree, because in my mind, in order to have an empty set in the first place, you need a conceptualized, a device capable of conceptualization to call it a set. The label of set is a thing itself, and what is the cause of the thing itself in that case? It's our minds. And so, obviously, before our minds were around, there could be no empty sets. If what we're observing, the set, is caused by mind, then without mind, there can be no set. But again, Buddhism is sort of this tricky thing, because they also believe that it is codependent with mind, and mind is fundamental in the substance of reality. But again, I'm not a Buddhist, so let's not bother addressing that. But what I am is a monist, and that's why I call myself a pantheist. I do think that it's reasonable to come to the conclusion that all things stem from a single undifferentiated source. And again, this goes back to the particular iterants of particles being a property of an underlying wave field. This is sort of the whole thing with the Higgs boson. Like, there's this Higgs field from which particles derive their mass. But again, it's this undifferentiated thing that doesn't exist in three-dimensional space. It exists beyond that, at the metaphysical level. And yes, I mean, physics addresses it. But when I say metaphysical, I mean something which goes beyond the physical world that we observe. And I think certainly you can find evidence in the physical world from things above it, just like you can see a shadow of a four-dimensional object in a three-dimensional world, but you can't see the thing itself. But you do have access to this sort of beyond the three-dimensional, within the three-dimensional. In the same way, modern physics sort of captures this metaphysical realm through physics. But again, you don't even need to conceive of it in physics. The way I've done this before has been with a kind of simple little thought experiment. So without perspective, being can't have differentiation, right? Whatever it is that causes perspective, that thing has a being. And so in that sense, being is prior to perspective, because, in order for perspective to exist, that perspective must have a being. So fundamentally, beyond perspective is being. And really, there are two conclusions. Either there is this substance of being that exists prior to perspective, in which case the universe is undifferentiated at a certain level, at a certain metaphysical level, or they codependently arise. It's that, either being and perspective are bound together, or they're not. And that leads to Buddhism or not Buddhism. And I think there are probably other philosophical schools besides Buddhism that believe in this sort of codependent origin of perspective and being. But I don't have familiarity with any of them. And I do think that because of the physics, the monist explanation, the undifferentiated being explanation, really does work better, and it fits better with the B theory of time, which has more grounding in modern physics. And I just think from all these different sources, monism just tends to make sense, and it makes sense in an intuitive level. In our language, we call things being. We describe a property that all things have. All things have existence. And that's what Heidegger tries to get at. What is the nature of existence itself? Because it seems to be a thing. Existence itself, being itself, well, not a thing in the sense of a thing having bounds. It is a substance, clearly. It's a self-evident thing. And that's sort of the idea of Dasein. We have direct evidence of it because we are a thing that can speculate on it. And because we're speculating on the notion of being must exist. It's something that's brought out by the investigation. By looking at what being is, we make it self-evident. It emerges upon examination. So anyway, that's sort of the monist position. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with nihilism? Well, that sort of gets into what is the thing that causes perspective. Because if you're a monist, if you believe that there is an undifferentiated reality underlying the differentiation, the perspectival space that we observe, then what exactly accounts for perspective? Because there's undifferentiated being at a certain level, and then at another level there's perspective. And there seems to be a negative force that delineates content from content. Obviously, the universe is not saturated with all being, because there are things which have existence that have a differentiated existence. So what is this zero force? What is the negative force that causes perspective? And I've come to the conclusion, it's interesting, because I call myself a nihilist, but maybe I shouldn't, in the sense that the position that I hold is that the thing that we call nothing is itself a property of being, because relation is a property of being. The syntax is something that is included in being. It's more practical to label it something other than being, because it clearly behaves differently clearly in the hierarchy of what exists, being, it can be self-contained with no differentiation, with no perspective, with no zero space. And then at a certain level, it can also exist with the zero space included. And even if the zero space, even if nothing is a thing, even if nothing exists as a component of being, which I do believe it must, just sort of by definition, I guess, because nothing could not act. Nothing, the concept of a true nothingness, can never influence being, you know, because there's nothing there to influence being in the first place. Nothing is always really tricky to talk about. But anyway, so it's sort of an issue of definition that as we define it, nothing clearly doesn't exist. Because that's the whole idea of the concept. Nothing is supposed to be something which does not exist, and so nothing doesn't exist. But at the same time, there is some sort of zero space. There is some sort of component of reality which generates perspective. And I don't know the nature of that thing any more than I know the nature of the rest of being. But that thing seems to be the important thing. And the Hindus label it Shiva. In their cosmology, Brahma is the undifferentiated being, Vishnu is the perceiver, and Shiva is the destroyer, the zero space. And without Shiva the destroyer, there can be no Vishnu. Without the zero space, there can be no perspective, and therefore no perception, no mind. So when I say that I'm a nihilist, I believe that our identity rests far more in the nature of that zero space than in the nature of the undifferentiated reality. Because in a certain sense, I mean, undifferentiated reality is a little boring. I mean, I may not know exactly its nature, or its cause, or its origin, or whatever, but I know what it is. It's something that's undifferentiated. It's something that's completely homogeneous in its existence. And it's a simple entity. It's an irreducibly simple entity. So since we are complex entities, we owe everything that we identify with ourselves, not to this undifferentiated being, but to the zero space, to the thing, the component of being, which gives rise to time and space. And that's in the sense, I'm a nihilist in that I worship Shiva, in the sense that I believe that our identity is formed from the zero space and not so much, it doesn't have so much to do with the underlying undifferentiated reality. And it's just to sort of bring a little concreteness to this, because I'm sure at this point it's a whole bunch of just scattered brain matter all over the place. Hopefully you've grabbed onto some portion of it. Not sure that I have, but anyway, let's solidify this in an example. So I subscribe to the idea that identity, just practically self-identity, is best restricted to consciousness, but not just consciousness, more specifically to knowledge. Your identity is your knowledge. If you had no knowledge, you'd have no identity. It's fairly straightforward. You take away all knowledge, and you are a non-identity, because there is no you there to speculate on the In order to speculate on the existence of yourself, in order to be a Dasein, you must have knowledge. And so there is sort of we find dichotomies in nature all the time, binary oppositions, and this is one of them. There seems to be the state of zero knowledge, and then there seems to be the state of maximum knowledge. You know, we don't know exactly the character of that. Maybe infinite, may not, but there's definitely a direction. There's a one-dimensional axis. On the one side, zero. On the other side, the maximum. And so you're not really defined so much by your particular. I do say that identity is bound up in the issue of knowledge, but I may have misspoken earlier. I don't really think that knowledge itself constitutes your identity, because knowledge itself is something that exists outside of yourself. Any particular knowledge that you can have is something that anyone else can have as well. Pieces of knowledge can be known by multiple people. And so in that sense, the individual pieces of knowledge, every individual piece of knowledge, doesn't really account for you as an individual, because that stuff is out there. Especially when you bring in things like the many worlds theory, there's always something out there that knows everything you know and more. So your identity can't really be said to rest solely in the nature of the knowledge that you have. It's not in the nature of the knowledge, it's in the limitation of the knowledge. Your identity rests in what you don't know. Your identity rests at the barrier of your identity. And in that sense, you are nothing. You, the identity of yourself, your self-identity, the created individual, is determined by the nothingness, the zero space, the limitation that surrounds that knowledge. And maybe that's a little bit far from most people's conception of nihilism, but I'm a nihilist in the sense that I believe that what constitutes your identity is the nothing, is the limitation. Limitation is far more important than the knowledge itself in constituting your identity. But this sort of gets into some psychological issues relating to identity, because Nietzsche and Schopenhauer before him describe the will to power, and that's sort of the urge underlying all life, and in a larger sense, all material reality, towards self-replication, towards self-empowerment. Everything seeks power. Everything seeks to become more than it is. And so because we're sort of bound up in that, because it's just this constant cycle of life that there seems to be no escape from, what we tend to do is attempt to increase our knowledge and therefore increase our self. But again, the nature of yourself rests not in the knowledge that you have, but in the limitation of that knowledge. And so the realization that we need to come to is that the will to power is a will to become other than yourself, and that nothing's wrong with being yourself. Nothing is wrong with limited knowledge. You know, that goes back to moral nihilism. There's no moral imperative to obey the will to power. We can ignore it if we choose to, and we can say that true knowledge is knowing that you know nothing. True knowledge is that in the face of infinity, in the face of divinity, in the face of the maximum knowledge, you are insignificant, and that any sort of attempt to increase yourself, to approach the maximum, is doomed to fail. And that's because you identify with the barrier, you identify with the limit. And in some ways, so we attempt to increase ourselves, we attempt to approach the maximum, we attempt to become one with reality by addition, because that seems like the logical implication, and it's supported by the will to power. But what's actually the more powerful is the subtraction method, and it's a sort of another instance of my nihilism. I believe, first of all, that identity rests in the limitation, and second of all, I believe that realizing that the limitation itself is nothing is critical to removing the sense of self, to removing the self-identity that binds you to the eternally repeating cycle, to the chain of karmic existence, to differentiated reality, to the suffering of mankind, to the vicissitudes of the material world. That's what we should be escaping, and that's sort of what Hinduism understands. And it's of course not a should be. It's just an issue of what's healthy for the human psychology. Human psychology rewards an understanding of the thing greater than yourself, because individuals can't be wholly selfish. Individuals can't just obey the will to power, because it's also advantageous to sacrifice yourself, to realize that there are greater things than yourself, to lay down yourself for something else. And that's the nihilist portion of this, that I don't believe in the self. I believe that people create their selves by identifying with the nothing. They create the self by identifying with the limits on their consciousness. That's what people really do. I mean, people think they identify themselves with the knowledge, but no, they identify themselves with the limitation on their knowledge. And I say that Socrates was more wise, and that he understood that knowledge is unattainable, that you can't achieve the maximum through addition. You can only achieve it by subtraction. You can only say, remove the notion of the limit on your identity, and stop caring what this particular brain knows, because the knowledge is out there, whether or not this brain knows it. You know, you can place your identity in the whole instead of the part. And I think there's even physical reasons to believe that. If determinism holds true, which it has so far in physics, there are obviously what we perceive to be indeterminate effects in quantum mechanics, but again, I'm using the many worlds interpretation, which is deterministic. But anyway, if determinism holds true, then you are causally linked to everything. The Buddhists are right a little bit that all being is codependently related. Well, yes, because if any component were missing, then it wouldn't be the totality. It would be something else. So everything is, the identity of the whole is bound together. The whole relies on every part. And, you as an individual identity, the matter that goes into you comes from everywhere. It comes from stars, and then the sense data that you receive, it comes
comes from everywhere. I mean, it's photons that have been traveling, millions of years, bouncing off things and hitting you and altering you. You are altered by your environment in all these ways, and you're. I mean, we think of ourselves as these isolated systems that are really self-motivated. That we have free will to be ourselves, but the belief in free will is what that temptation, the idea, because it's so consistent with the will to power. We want to believe that we have free will because we want to believe we can achieve the addition method of approaching the maximum, but you can't. It's not accessible because you are a part. That's your nature. Your nature is being a part of the system. And so the healthier thing to do is to embrace that sort of sense of unity, that sense of connectedness with all of reality. I mean, and really, just from a moral nihilist perspective, there's no reason to identify with yourself. There's no reason to identify with your superego or your ego or your id. Why? I mean, you can do it pragmatically, practically, but there's nothing saying that it's better to identify with yourself. It may turn out to be more useful, but that's a whole other issue. But then on the other hand, what are the uses? What is the practicality of not identifying with those things? Because the great religious leaders in the Dharmic faiths have all followed that path. The people who have achieved the state that we tend to refer to as nirvana or enlightenment, those people have done the subtraction method. They haven't tried to go out and read every book and learn everything. They've realized that knowledge is something outside of their accessibility, and that you can't identify with the knowledge, you can't identify with the limitation, you can only identify with the whole. And it maybe this is superstitious, but they say that nirvana comes along with a sort of perfect understanding of the system, that when you stop making it a part of your everyday experience to identify with the part, and you identify with the whole, you come to understand the whole better, which, maybe it's not a perfect knowledge as they sort of purport it to be, but hey, I mean, it might be a better understanding that the typical person has, because the typical person doesn't understand shit. But that's all I wanted to say about nihilism, I guess. Yeah, again, sorry if this was probably a little bit scattered, so my bad, but hopefully you got something out of it. Thanks for listening.